Brothers and sisters in Christ, an elderly lady was told she had to face a serious operation, and to console her, people told her that they would pray for her. She said, "If God has plans for me, I would not want him to change them." A lot of praying, a lot of faith went into that sentence. If God has plans for me, I would not want him to change them. Because there's a lot of trust in that sentence, in the face of death. A lot of faith, a lot of confidence. A lot of confidence in the goodness and blessing of God. And it comes to my mind because I was fortunate enough to be close to Bishop Michael Paschal in the latter months of his life. And I can tell you, his last months were filled with joy, faith, confidence and trust. Some months ago, he went for a checkup to the doctor, and in his direct way, Paschal said, "Will I see Christmas?" The doctor said, "No, 2 or 3 months." So he will not see Christmas, but he will see Christ. And so we commend him to the Lord today, because in his death as in his living, he showed us what faith is. It was a death worthy of St. Francis himself, who said, "Welcome, Sister Death." He also faced death with humour, as was very characteristic of him. One time he woke up and found a number of us around the bed in his last week, and he said, "I thought I'd be seeing the face of Jesus, but instead it is you." You can understand it was a big letdown for him. He used to say, "Why is the Lord delaying him? Delaying. I want to see him." Now, this approach to death, this radiance, this joy, this confidence facing certain death, comes from a living faith. And that is what I want to underline, because when we speak at a funeral homily, you know, it's not just to speak about the person in himself, but to speak about him as a person of faith in whom we saw signs of God's presence. We saw something reflected of Jesus in him. And I want to say that which we see in our Father Bishop Michael Paschal we see in him faith. A faith that grew up with a very fervent family in London. He was born there 83 years ago. A faith that was strengthened in a Catholic school in London. And then he joined the Franciscan order as novice and finally professed and became a priest. And so we see right through his life the fingers of God, the footprints of God, as St. Francis would say, in the attitude, in the faith he professed and had. Now, this faithfulness is indeed characteristic of God. It's essential to the nature of God to be faithful, to be loving. Because you see it in the Bible wherever you go. Remember, our teaching in Catholic Church comes from the Bible all the time, this Bible. So we see God's faithfulness leading the people out of Egypt. "I have heard my people's cry," he said. We have seen the faithfulness of God at the Jordan River after the death of Moses, when they faced the enormous task of moving across the river to Jericho and into the desert and cities of Judea. God said at least 8 times to Joshua, "Remember, I am with you." Again to David and his house, God promised to be faithful to them. To Jeremiah, who cried out when he was called, "But I'm only a child," God said, "Do not be afraid, I will give you my words." Again to Jesus, facing the disaster of Golgotha. It seems to have been a failure. It seems that God failed him. And yet Golgotha and the resurrection on Easter Sunday morning is the most glorious moment of all, is the most glorious sign and action of God's faithfulness. Because in Golgotha and in the Paschal mystery, we see the resurrection, the door being opened, the life of the Spirit being poured out on the world. It is in this that we see the faithfulness of God. I want to say then that Paschal reflected this faith and this faithfulness of God. You know, he gave himself to the Franciscan order to become a servant of God like St. Francis. He came to South Africa in 1955. That is 57 years ago. And now, 57 years later, we see the journey has ended, but he has remained faithful to that journey. And it was a difficult journey in many times. He came in 1955. Can you imagine today the South Africa of 1955? And that area, what was then called the Eastern Transvaal, those grey plains, boring plains of the Eastern Transvaal, in the bleak days of apartheid. He came to a discarded people to tell them, you are not forgotten. He had courage and faithfulness in spite of the oppression of those times. His Honour Nkosi Buthelezi has pointed out the beautiful journey that Paschal travelled with his people. He was faithful as a parish priest in Umhlamayo, going on horseback from place to place. He was faithful in Standerton. In those days, the only entertainment was not television, but fixing washing machines. And so he became an adept at this with later Father Stan. When you went there as a visitor, he had to go to the sacristy to get some altar wine to entertain you. These were the times that he lived through out here in South Africa. He lived through the removals from here, Kwatlati. People went over from Maran and here over to Ekurhuleni, Lime Hill and those places. Many of the friars who came out with him from the English province were expelled from this area. But Paschal remained on. He had courage, he had faithfulness. He was there for the founding of the Franciscan province. He wanted to share that gift that God had given him. And he saw, and we must admit it, a relative collapse in the world from which he came, in the area of faith in Western Europe. He had to go back there and face scandal after scandal. And as it were, this silent apostasy, as it's called in the documents for the present synod, a silent apostasy. It was hard to be a bishop, to have faith, to give strength and courage to people in the world in which we live today. He was the first Bishop of Dundee. He's followed by a worthy successor today, I'm happy to say. He had to provide this, yes, unwieldy diocese. It's an unwieldy diocese. It runs from Colenso to near Pretoria, to try and bring this church, these churches, into some kind of unity, and to bring signs of God's love to people in those areas. And you can see many symbols, not only symbols, but concrete signs of his energy and his love in providing for the people in this area. Pax Christi. We remember the AGM every year where he calls all the priests together to make them all feel at home. Franciscans, Consolatus, and now happily so much the diocesan clergy. The AGM, of course, all the priests attended because he generally gave Christmas gifts at that meeting. He provided old age homes, places for the orphans, churches, priests, local priests. These are the fruits of the efforts of Bishop Paschal, and you just have to look around you and see this magnificent mission of Maria Ratchett's, which was falling into ruin. And he called the Nardini sisters, who have transformed this into an oasis of beauty, a magnificent place. This is a symbol of what can be achieved in grace when you work with people who are also faithful to grace. In St. Paul's in London, Christopher Wren was the architect, builder of St. Paul's in London. And when you walk in the door, on one side there's a plaque which says, "Do not ask where his memorial is." I mean, where is the memorial of this architect? Look around you. This church is the memorial to the architect. And that's what I say. Look around Dundee today. Look around this very mission today. That is the real monumental stone that we erect, or that Bishop Paschal has erected to his love and faithfulness to Christ. So there was a great faithfulness in him. In fact, you could almost say a fierce faithfulness in him. And anything contrary to the church, to the good of the church, annoyed him immensely. He reacted immediately with words. He wasn't too diplomatic. His sensitivities did not inhibit his responses sometimes. This too, however, came from his faithfulness and his love for the church in which Jesus is present. Jesus did not write a book.